Hello. Um, in this lecture, we're going to be discussing the selection from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the letter from the Birmingham jail that is found in your textbook. So this is the counterpoint or the counter argument to the one we discussed last time. So last time we had discussed the Credo by Plato, in that is the dialogue where Socrates gives the argument against civil disobedience. And of course, Martin Luther King was involved in a lot of civil disobedience. So we would imagine that um, he's going to be giving the other side of it. So, first, we always want to take a look at the introductory remarks, which are on page 356 and 357. And there we learn that the context of the letter, which I think is really important. So it was on Good Friday, April 12th, 1963, that Dr. King was put behind bars for violating an injunction against public demonstration, right? So that's what he was doing. So he was in Birmingham. He was coordinating some actions there, and that effectively he was put in jail for uh, parading without a permit is what he was doing. So we want to take a look at that. While he was in jail, what he did was he wrote this letter, and the letter is to the white clergy. So um, there's a specific audience here. He's expecting and anticipating that his audience of Christian pastors, right, is going to be familiar with Scripture, is going to be familiar with the history of the church, is going to be well educated, and that ultimately that they are persuadable. So his expectation is going to be that his audience takes their shared beliefs, that the Christian beliefs they have in common, more seriously than the beliefs that they don't share. And so he's anticipating being able to reach common ground with his audience. And that's where he's at. So the letter is dated, we'll see on page 358, April 16th, 1963, and he addresses it to his fellow clergymen. So sometimes we forget that Dr. Martin Luther King was a pastor, he was a Christian clergyman. Um, and immediately he tells the audience his reason for writing. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. And then he says, seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time to do anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day. But he's saying that, he's in jail, so he doesn't have much else to do, so he's going to write them back, right? And he answers them. And this is important. He has a great deal of respect for the people that he's writing to, and he answers the questions that they have. So right away we see here that they have this perspective, the white pastors, of the disturbances in Birmingham being outsiders coming in, right? And Dr. King answers them. He says, I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South. And one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, right? Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. And several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So what is he saying? He says, so I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here. Right? So he answers them immediately, right? Because the white clergy was concerned that these were outside agitators coming in, and he wants to say, no, no, no. We have organizational ties here. We have been working with people locally for a long time, and they invited us to come here. That's why I'm here. I'm here because I was invited here. Right? So he answers. But then he answers more basically. He says, more basically, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. See, we see that he's addressing his audience. His audience, we know, highly approves and venerates St. Paul. And so he's explaining what he's doing in terms of a person that the audience holds in high esteem. Right? And he clarifies, he says, I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He continues, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. So we have seen this recently in our own time with the George Floyd demonstrations, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that we had a couple of summers ago, where we had all of these protests. And then there were some people who deplored the violence of the protests, and a similar point could have been made. You know, you are deploring the protests, but you're not in a similar way deploring the conditions that make the protests manifest, right? He says, and this is at the bottom of 359, it is unfortunate that the demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. So we should say a few remarks here about language. This is a historical document that was written in 1963, and the norms of American English were different then. But it is valuable, I think, to read the words that Dr. King wrote. And so where he uses the term Negro, whereas we wouldn't use that in our own speech in this day and time, we will read the words that he wrote. Okay, so just a word about that. So he goes on to talk about his plans for nonviolent actions, right? He says in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that radical injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings in Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any other city in the nation. And these are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiations. Right? So what is he doing? He's correcting the false impressions that his audience has. That because they're going to ask, why didn't you negotiate in good faith? Why didn't you, petition the authorities for changes? Why do you engage in this direct action protest? And so he's going to correct them that they have done that, right? In the course of the negotiation, certain promises were made by the merchants, for example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. Right? They had negotiated with individual businesses, they had negotiated with the Chamber of Commerce. And on the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations. So he is allowing his audience to see, this is just really a masterful piece of persuasive writing, because he's allowing his audience to see, without accusing them, right, of how their misconceptions were wrong. Right? Then he says, as the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs briefly removed returned, but the others remained. As in so many past experiences, our hopes had been blasted, and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. Right? So this what he's talking about here is nonviolent protest. And the world has seen several nonviolent protest movements. The first of which is, and this is really an inspiration to Dr. King, was the movement of Mohandas Gandhi in India, successfully ending the British occupation, right? Where you really are appealing to the conscience of those who are in power, so that you're getting them to change their own behavior because they don't understand how what they're doing is affecting other human beings. And this is something that we've seen a lot of, right? So we saw it in India, we saw it in the American Civil Rights Movement, and then we saw it again in many ways in the revolutions of 1989, when the Iron Curtain came down and the Soviet Union crumbled. The Soviet Union fell without violence or bloodshed, but because the conscience of those in power had changed. In the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Now, it hadn't changed previously. We can think back to the Prague Spring, which is, or the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which is closer to Dr. King in time. Um, those were also nonviolent movements, but they didn't end well. Okay, so let's continue with what he's saying. So we had no alternative except to take direct action. And so they had a series of workshops on nonviolence. They prepared themselves, right? And this is something that didn't happen during the more spontaneous George Floyd protests. There was not preparation and training, right? So they got themselves ready to accept blows without retaliating, right? To accept the ordeal of jail. And they had decided to schedule their direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year, right? Because they wanted to do it at a time when it gained attention. He says, but then it occurred to us that Birmingham's mayoral election was coming up in March, and we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day. Right? They are trying to not be political. And their accusers, I'm sure, that's one of the most common things that they were saying, was that you're turning everything political. You're making everything be about politics, when in fact the very opposite was the case, that they were trying to be higher than the politics of the day. Right? Then on page 361 in the middle, he gets back to addressing their concerns. He says, you may well ask why direct action, why sit-ins, marches, and so forth. Isn't negotiation a better path? Right? And then he answers, well, negotiation is a better path. That is the whole goal of direct action. is to get to the point where you can have negotiation. Um, and that's what it is. Nonviolent action tries to create tension so that change can happen. And then he is going to cite some authorities that his audience is familiar with and that now we are familiar with. And this is really interesting because we just heard the authority that he's going to cite make the other case, right? He says, just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create tension in the minds so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so we must see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help man rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. Right? Because his audience knows that Socrates suffered an injustice in his execution for trying to help people to think better about their circumstances. Sorry for the blip. I had to sneeze. But let's get back to our text. I want to go to the quite toward the bottom of 362, where he is addressing the concern that his opposition has of why are you so hasty? You know, why can't you wait? Why can't you wait for the wheels of justice to turn? Right. So the wheels of justice turn slowly. We've heard this. Why can't you wait for that? And he addresses that. He says, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God given rights. Right? And then he continues, because Americans, he's going to appeal here to the sense of American exceptionalism that his audience has, that America is the best place. That America is the place with the most freedom, right? But then I was going to say that these Americans, the Black Americans, have waited 340 years, and now he's going to show us the other people of the world, the non-Americans, and what they have, right? The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. Right? And then this next part is kind of long, but I'm going to read it in its entirety because it's, I think, the most um, evocative evocative section of this letter. It says, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes, oh, and we won't read this word, when your first name becomes and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, when your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title of Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. And then over on the next page, 364, he's going to give what in essence is the logical argument of the piece, right? He's going to give what he would call the logical arguments of the piece. He says, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws." Right? So this speaks directly to Socrates' point, right? The law is to be respected because the law created you. The law can place demands upon you. The law gives you gifts. You owe an obligation to the law, right? This is certainly a legitimate concern since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. And at first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us to consciously break laws. Right? That's the act of civil disobedience. One may well ask, how can you advocate the breaking of some laws and the obeying of others? Right? This is the very question that the law, so when Socrates conjured up the law in the Credo, this is the very question that she asked him. How can you advocate the, the breaking of some laws and the obedience to others? Well, Martin Luther King has the answer to that, right? And it's not even his answer, but it is an answer that came after Socrates, quite a ways after Socrates. It says the answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Right? So he is conjuring up St. Augustine, this 4th century Christian theologian, one of the theological giants of Western Christianity, who did say this. He said an unjust law is no law at all, and that we don't owe our obedience to any unjust laws. And this is the whole basis of King's argument, right? That the law makes demands on us, moral demands on us, when the law is being moral. And if there's an unjust demand on us, well, then the law is not making that demand. So what we have really is a concept that the law is there to serve humanity. And humanity is not there to serve the law. So there's something like this in the words of Christ when people were accusing him of breaking the law. So and this isn't just the civil law, but the divine law, the law of Moses, right? Because Christ was healing on a Sunday, right? Christ was healing on a Sunday, and he was accused of breaking the Sabbath, which was the law that you should not do work on Sunday. And Christ says to his accusers, he says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That the law is there to serve the better interests of humanity, and humanity is not there to serve the law. And this is the argument that King makes. And he's making it to a religious audience. And that's why it's so effective. Right? So let's continue. Let's go a little bit farther. This is on page 364. It says, now what is the difference between the two, between a just law and an unjust law? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? This is an important question, right? Because if you don't get this one right, then you'll have anarchy. It says a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. Right? He's talking to clergymen. This is an effective argument. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, who we have read, right? An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in the eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts the human personality is just. Any law that degrades the human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator, a false sense of superiority, and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, Martin Buber in mid-20th century was a philosopher that was very much appreciated by pastors, by these Christian clergy that he's writing to, even though he was a Jew. Right? Martin Buber says it substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation, he says, is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Morally wrong and sinful. And if we have something that is morally wrong and sinful, and the civil law doesn't reflect that, then the civil law is what's in error and must be changed. Right? It cannot be obeyed. It has to be resisted in conscience. And then he quotes Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was a mid-20th century Christian theologian, very popular. So Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, and his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. And then he gets into the concrete. Let us consider, and this is on page 365, let us consider a concrete example. An unjust law code. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power minority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. Right? A just law is a code that the majority compels a minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. Well, what does this sound like? Right? We just spent last week talking about the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, and we talked about how that is derived from the concept of the law itself, which has to be universal. Well, this sounds a lot like Kant, right? A just law code is that which a majority compels the minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. If it's not willing to follow itself, then it's not universal. So here we see a second argument. So first he makes a natural law argument, which comes out of the virtue ethics tradition, and second he's making a deontological argument. Right? That's what this is. Let's go further down the page because he talks about his circumstance specifically. This is on 365. Sometimes a law is just on its face but unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, right? And so we know this. So our college is in Hancock, and Hancock has some parades. We just had the Bridge Fest parade, which went through the city of Hancock, and it's important. And then in the wintertime in January, they'll have the Hakenbiba parade, and it's important that parades in Hancock get a permit. Where there's not very many roads, right? You have to if, for example, you really can't obstruct people's ability to get to the hospital, right? There's only two hospitals in the Keweenaw, and they're both on the Hancock side of the bridge, and there are emergencies, and you can't obstruct that. You have to be able to get there. So parades which close roads are important to regulate. You have to make sure that you're allocating enough police officers, that emergency vehicles have a plan, because these things have to happen. You won't want to stop commerce in its entirety. You oftentimes you're going to be setting up detours. None of these things are unjust. They're essential. And one of the things that makes them just is their equal application to all people, right? But he says such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. Remember that King said earlier that they had already tried negotiation. Of course, they want to cooperate with the city, because they want to bring a situation of justice to the city. He says, I hope you are able to see the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy, right? That would lead to anarchy. And now he's going to bring in the big guns. He's going to show how what he is doing to fight injustice in Birmingham is what some of the heroes that the other clergymen hold in high esteem did in the Bible. He says, of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evident sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake, right? So this is a story from the book of Daniel, right, where the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon, and these three young men, their Hebrew names were Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael. They were given these new Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were compelled to follow these um, Babylonian laws that were at odds with the Hebrew laws, and they refused. They refused. They refused to follow these laws because they were at odds with justice, right? These are heroes of the book of Daniel, right? They did not worship the pagan idols. And what happened to them, right, is they were thrown in the fiery furnace to be executed, and they were saved by a miracle, right? So this clearly shows precedent in the text held sacred by his opposition that God approves of civil disobedience, because that was the case with these three young men, right? And then he goes on, he says, it was practiced, so civil disobedience was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than to submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. Then he says, to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Well, I don't think Socrates practiced civil disobedience, but his execution was seen by the tradition as fundamentally unjust. And then he says, we should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters in Hungary did was illegal. So he's talking to contemporary events there, right? So he's writing this in 1963. This that's at a time when World War II was less than 20 years ago. Like 20 years prior would have been 1943, right in the midst of the war. These are fresh memories. A lot of the people that he's writing to are World War II veterans. That's the generation that was in power in America at that time. The Hungarian freedom fighters, he's referring to the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which tried to, throw off the yoke of the communists. Right, these people were considered heroes, and they were run over by tanks. Right, it was illegal to aid and to comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. Right? He knows his audience. He knows to whom he is speaking. He goes on for the rest of the letter, which do please read the whole thing. I'm going to stop here because we're a little bit over 30 minutes, and we're going to have some other lectures this week. So there's going to be a lot of time to write. We have covered his main point, right, which is there's a difference between the civil law and the moral law. And where the civil law disagrees with the moral law, you have an obligation to obey the higher law. This is true in the virtue tradition. It is true in the deontological tradition. And it is also true in the utilitarian tradition, right? Where the thing that's going to come up is going to end in the best result is the thing that you should do regardless of what the law is. So the first contemporary question, that is civil disobedience, we've covered now. We've covered no civil disobedience. That's the argument from Socrates. And then the importance of disobeying unjust laws in a way that is civilly disobedient. And that comes from Dr. Martin Luther King.